Hello, I'm Robert Simmons. I'm here today with another of the chapters that are in my new book, The Alchemy of Stones. You're seeing this cover backwards because of the video equipment I'm using, but the book has now been published and it's available from my company, Heaven and Earth. And the website for that company, if you're interested in the book, is www.heavenandearthjewelry.com. That's all spelled out as one word. So I just mentioned that now, and we'll get into the topic of today's conversation, which is Chapter 2 of The Alchemy of Stones. And the title of that chapter is Panpsychism. So what is Panpsychism? Most people haven't really heard of it, but it's a very ancient idea that was described by anthropologists when they found it in indigenous cultures as, they called it animism. And you begin to get the sense of it because you think animism means that everything around us has consciousness, has animation, you might call it. And of course, the word anima is the Latin word that means soul. So really, animism was an idea that many traditional cultures had, which meant that they believed that all things had soul qualities and therefore had what we call consciousness. Now, why is this important in the Alchemy of Stones? The quick answer is to say that when we feel energy from a stone, that energy is not a physical energy. There's never been a machine that's been able to measure crystal energy, although many people can feel it. And what that means to me is that we're meeting that energy with our own consciousness, and what we're meeting is the consciousness that's inherent in the stone. Once you get into that kind of a worldview about it, it's possible to recognize the stones as beings. And once we begin down that path, we find that the alchemy part of it opens up very rapidly. That's because the alchemists always believed that the earth and all things in the earth were spiritually alive, and that working in co-creative cooperation with the materials that they had in their laboratories was absolutely essential to the success of the work they were attempting. So it's very fundamental to the idea of spiritual alchemy to view the whole world, the earth itself, and all things on the earth as having soul. And so I'll begin now with the chapter itself, and I'll read it to you and probably comment along the way. To me, this is a real mind-opening kind of chapter because we've been taught that the only things in the world that have consciousness are people and maybe some animals, but certainly not bacteria or plants, and definitely not stones. That worldview is a kind of limited way of putting a sort of screen on top of our experience of life, and I think it's one that takes a great deal of heart out of our existence. So we need, I believe, a worldview to be different, a new worldview that's also an ancient worldview, the alchemical worldview, in which we view and experience everything around us as conscious and spiritually alive. All right, so here's the chapter on panpsychism. It begins with some quotes from various well-known authors that put their own point of view onto this subject. The first author is Ervin Laszlo, who wrote The Immortal Mind, Science and the Continuity of Consciousness Beyond the Brain. And Laszlo says this: consciousness is present in the mineral kingdom, in the living world, and in the social and ecological systems constituted by human beings and other organisms. It is present at the level of quanta at one end of the spectrum of size and complexity in nature, and on the level of galaxies at the other end. So he draws a big picture. Everything from quanta, the smallest units that we know of that exist or tend to exist, and galaxies, the largest self-organized systems that we have ever been able to observe. He says all of that has consciousness. Now the next quote comes from a man named David Fiedler in a book called Restoring the Soul of the World. And David says, even at the level of the tiniest molecules and single-cell organisms, we encounter self-organizing and self-maintaining activities that reflect the rudiments of awareness or mentality. The deployment of form in time and space depends upon the power of selection. For example, the growth of a crystal involves the proper arrangement of more than 10 billion with a B, molecules a minute. Matter itself is active and self-organizing, and the molecules of the crystal know how to bond in harmony with one another to create a highly coherent structure. In its own way, the growing crystal is an intelligent, self-regulating organism. I couldn't agree with him more. Our next quote comes again from Mr. Fiedler, and he says this: modern science has overthrown every foundational assumption of the mechanistic worldview and suggests that we live within a pattern of a systematically unfolding, self-organizing, cosmic organism that is finely tuned for the emergence of life. That's a mouthful. But what he's saying is that science itself is showing us now that consciousness exists inherent as a fundamental quality of the universe, and that is the wellspring from which all the self-organizing systems, including ourselves, arise. Now, the next comment is from the great biologist and visionary Rupert Sheldrake, and he writes simply this: the life of biological organisms is different in degree, but not in kind, from physical systems like molecules and crystals. So he's saying that molecules and crystals have a life that is similar in kind, but not, similar in degree in terms of how much animation they show. That's how I interpret it. But not in kind in the sense that they are conscious as well as our organisms. So we go down a little bit more, and I'll give you a couple more quotes before we start the chapter itself. Another one is from Nikola Tesla, the visionary who's responsible for the fact that we can all plug in to AC electricity in our homes. He says, in a crystal we have the clear evidence of the existence of a formative life principle, and although we cannot understand the life of a crystal, it is nonetheless a living being. I think that speaks for itself. Now, Max Planck, the father of quantum theory, said this: behind the existence of all matter is a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. So this great physicist is saying that mind gives rise to matter. That's how I read it. And another quantum physicist, David Bohm, says this, and he wrote a fantastic book everyone should read called Wholeness and the Implicate Order. Bohm says, the ultimate source of intelligence is not in the brain, but is enfolded into the whole. So again, the ultimate source of intelligence is inherent in all parts and in everything within the universe. Okay, so if that's all true, I don't think we have to scratch our heads too much to decide that crystals can exhibit consciousness when we relate to them with our consciousness. But enough comments, let's start with the chapter here. I write, as I mentioned earlier, the materialist worldview that prevails in much of our world today assumes that matter is devoid of awareness and that consciousness, if it exists at all, is only within human beings. The alchemists believed otherwise. They viewed matter, including plants and animals, stars and stones, as being ensouled, aware, and spiritually alive. The world itself had a soul, a great and intelligent soul of wisdom with whom the alchemists must work in order to achieve their great work. In philosophy, Panpsychism is the view that consciousness, mind, or soul is a universal and primordial feature of all things. It is one of the oldest philosophical theories and has been ascribed to the ancient Greek philosophers Thales, Parmenides, and Plato, as well as the line of great thinkers that include Spinoza, Leibniz, William James, and quantum physicist David Bohm, as well as psychologist Carl Jung. The roots of panpsychism can be found in the animistic beliefs of many indigenous cultures around the world, as well as in Shinto, Taoism, paganism, and shamanism. All of these thinkers and spiritual traditions believed, as did the alchemists, that consciousness is a fundamental feature of everything in the world. Now, the term panpsychism has its origins in the Greek terms pan, which means all, everything, or whole, and psyche, meaning soul or mind. Psyche comes from the Greek word psycho, I blow or I breathe, and can mean life, soul, mind, spirit, heart, and life breath. From its roots, we could say that panpsychism refers to the notion that the breath of life, the soul, the center of consciousness, is everywhere. The psychologist Carl Jung, who introduced the concept of the collective unconscious and who had a lifelong interest in spiritual alchemy, wrote that, quote, psyche and matter are contained in one and the same world and, moreover, are in continuous contact with one another. He believed it probable that, quote, psyche and matter are two different aspects of one and the same thing. I think that's really putting his finger on it correctly. That's why panpsychism, soul or consciousness everywhere, makes sense. And it makes sense really not to divide matter and soul from one another, which is what he's saying there. According to the 9th century Shingon Buddhist thinker Kukai, the Dharmakaya, which is the formless body of consciousness, is nothing other than the physical universe, and the natural objects like rocks and stones are included as part of the supreme embodiment of the Buddha. So not only are your crystals conscious, but you could have a Buddha in there. The famed alchemist Paracelsus viewed the universe as one coherent organism pervaded by the uniting, life-giving spirit, and this in its entirety, humans included, was God. Jacob Boehme, the philosopher, writer, and alchemical theorist, also believed that God wasn't separate from creation, and that life force passed directly into stars, planets, plants, trees, humans, animals, stones, minerals, and every other thing via the cosmic mirror of Mother Nature, whom he knew as Sophia. Quote from Boehme, God shines with his power through all his beings, and each thing receives his power according to its property. So we'll come back to Sophia in later chapters. She's very central to spiritual alchemy from the past and to the Alchemy of Stones. From the point of view of panpsychism, stones indeed have consciousness and soul, as do we. Within such a worldview, it is not surprising that human beings can feel the vibrations of stones, and that we can learn to meet them as beings. Now here's some evidence that I've collected that panpsychism is true. Panpsychism is an attractive, rewarding idea, but is it true? In the world of philosophy, the debate rages on. We could delve into it, but I prefer to offer a list of examples that, for me, are powerful indicators that indeed there is consciousness in all things, that there is soul everywhere. One way to see this is to consider evidence showing that our own consciousness is not confined to our bodies. Out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, memories of past lives, instances of telepathy, and communication, with or without a medium, with the spirits of people who have died, all indicate that human consciousness extends beyond bodily boundaries. And I imagine many of you watching this have experienced one or more of these things. In the instances of past life memories and spirit communication, even death seems incapable of extinguishing consciousness. Secondly, the Savant Phenomenon. The Savant Phenomenon, dramatized in the 1988 movie Rain Man and documented in the 2006 film Beautiful Minds, The Psychology of the Savant, is a name given to cases in which individuals apparently receive complex information from sources beyond their own brains. This well-documented phenomena makes another hole in the wall of materialism and implies that we are nested within a vast web of intelligence. So just a comment on the Savant Phenomenon. I've studied this in my psychology studies, and some savants have access to information that is really impossible for them to have been exposed to except through this mysterious inner channel. I read about one savant who was institutionalized, yet he knew the make and model number of every car that drove by, and the model name of every car that drove by his window, and even the new ones that came out each year. There are other savants who can do mathematical calculations instantaneously, and they say that they simply see the answers, that they're just given to them. Sometimes they don't even see them as numbers, but as colors or shapes. So we could go into that much more. It's a fascinating subject, and I do urge you to look into it yourself. Look into the Savant Phenomenon. I've personally experienced many of the above phenomena, and most readers will be able to recall some instances that fit into one or more of these categories. Telephone telepathy, the experience of having the phone ring and knowing who's calling before you pick up the receiver, is a common occurrence. Biologist Rupert Sheldrake's research and experiments indicate that at least half the human population of those who have telephones have experienced this. And outside the human realm, there is much evidence for telepathic communication among animals. Wolves have been observed as being capable of communicating their location and intended movements to one another when they are miles out of sight and earshot. Scientific studies done by Rupert Sheldrake give clear evidence that dogs and other pets can often tell exactly when their owners are coming home. These experiments were controlled so that the pet's behavior displayed that they knew when the decision to come home was made, and could not be ascribed to habitual time of day, to sound cues, or to other material evidence. Even insects, such as termites, seem to be able to communicate telepathically when behaving cooperatively in activities such as building their nests. And this doesn't stop with the animal realm. Plants have also been observed to exhibit evidence that they too are conscious. In the famous book, The Secret Life of Plants, polygraph expert, that's lie detector expert, Cleve Baxter, described how he stumbled onto this evidence. Late one night, alone in his lab, he got the idea of hooking his lie detector to a Dracaena corn plant on his desk. Trying to imagine how he might provoke some kind of reaction from the plant, he decided on lighting a match to burn one of the leaves. He never got the chance to try it, though, because at the precise moment Baxter thought of doing so, the plant displayed a wild reaction on the polygraph, typical in humans of emotional distress. To all appearances, the plant had read his mind. This experiment has since been replicated many times, and a number of other experiments have shown that plants are aware of our intentions, can identify different individual people, and even seem to have compassion and empathy for the suffering and or death of other organisms. For an amazing overview of this material, watch the film. It's a 1979 film called The Secret Life of Plants, and you can find that on YouTube. It's fantastic. It'll blow your mind. Baxter realized that a new worldview was needed to account for his observations, and he worked on it for the next 40 years, performing a variety of experiments. In these, he found evidence of consciousness not only in plants, but also in such unlikely-sounding candidates as yogurt, infertile eggs, and saliva. He even discovered that a bit of saliva taken from someone's mouth exhibited awareness of the human donor's emotional state from hundreds of miles away. The term he eventually coined to describe the pervasive phenomena he had discovered was primary awareness. Now that term is virtually a synonym for what I'm calling panpsychism. Now, what about stones? For those of us who can feel crystal energies and who sense their qualities as being innately spiritual and numinous, some of the best evidence validating the idea of panpsychism comes from our own experiences. In my workshops, I always encourage participants to experiment with viewing the stones as beings, and we often do this in practices in which we engage a stone being in an inner dialogue. We ask the stone being about its nature and what sorts of things we might do together, and we write down the replies that we receive inwardly. Often, several different members of the group will get virtually the same message from the being of the same variety of stone. This occurs even when the type of stone is completely new to the participants. These communications can go much further, and with the relationship becoming one in which the stone becomes one's spiritual ally. So we'll discuss this more in some of the later chapters. Now, I have a practice here that you can do at home, and I do recommend it. It's called Meeting a Stone Being from the Heart. And if you viewers will excuse me, I'm going to have to take off my outer shirt here because the room is getting really warm. It's probably because I'm getting all excited about panpsychism. Anyway, in this practice, you can enter into relationship with the being of a stone. You'll also have the experience of perception through the heart. We'll discuss the heart's intelligence in a later section, but for now I suggest you just try the exercise and pay attention to your own experience. You can go to your collection of stones or to a crystal shop if you don't have a collection and choose a stone. Better yet, pay attention to a number of different stones and see if you get the feeling that one of them is choosing you. It's ideal if this is a kind of stone you don't know well already. That way, what you intuit about it will be new to you. So take that stone to a place where you can sit quietly. The next step is a simple step. Sit down and relax while holding the stone. Put all of your sensory attention on the stone. Look at its color, its shape, and detail. Feel its texture with your fingers, and touch it to your cheek. Smell it. Touch it with your tongue, if it's not a toxic stone, and even hold it up to your ear and listen. You may not taste or smell anything, and you're highly unlikely to hear anything, but giving attention in this way helps to sensitize your awareness. The next step, bring your subjective attention to the center of your heart and hold the stone in your two cupped hands a few inches away from your mouth. As you inhale, drawing the air over the stone and into your lungs, imagine that you're inviting the stone being into your heart. As you exhale, silently offer yourself to the stone being, letting it know that you are available for relationship. Continue this breathing for a few breaths, at least 3 and probably not more than 10, but let your intuition guide you. When you feel ready, bring the stone to your chest and hold it there, touching you. Let your eyes close and allow yourself to attend fully to your inner experience. Continue to affirm the invitation on the in-breath and the offer of yourself on the out-breath. Picture the stone's image responding to your invitation by moving into your chest, finally settling into the center of your heart. Notice what that feels like, and attend to the presence of the stone being in your heart. Greet it from your heart and thank it for coming into you. Feel all that? Now you can go back after you've heard me say this, and you can kind of get the steps down, because I'm going rather quickly. Let this meditation continue for several minutes. It's not necessary to do anything else other than maintain the visualization and give yourself over to whatever feelings or images you experience. Don't hold back. Don't hold back. Allow the heart to hold and cherish the stone beings. Now notice everything that happens. Sometimes this sort of meditation will trigger a more complex visionary experience. If that happens, go with it. If the stone being starts to communicate with you, attend to it inwardly and respond as your heart moves you to respond. Also, take note of your bodily sensations. You may feel the stone's energies moving into you and through your body. You may find that the currents travel to one or more specific places. If so, pay attention to where the energy goes and how it feels. Afterward, make notes about your experience in your journal. If nothing happens beyond the visualization you did, according to the instructions, don't be concerned. Just allow yourself to breathe and see and feel the stone in your heart. Continue to do this for at least 5 minutes. When you feel ready to stop, or have the sense that the session is completed, you can gently open your eyes. Now, this practice is the way that I begin all my intuitive work with stones. Following this ritual, each time one sits down with a stone does several things, aside from the overt performance of the instructions. First, it gives you a simple way to quiet distracting thoughts and direct your attention, both outwardly to the physical stone and inwardly to your inner experience of the stone. This is important because this sort of communication occurs in a subtle realm, and going there requires focused, sensitive attention. Second, this practice helps you learn to make your heart the place you go for spiritual work and experiences. Our hearts have their own intelligence, and they've long been viewed as the seat of the soul. The heart is the place where wisdom dwells within us, and where spiritual beings can most readily meet us. By practicing visualizations in the heart, you will become familiar with how it feels to be heart-centered, and you'll come to recognize the heart's distinctive intelligence. You've heard of the still small voice inside. I believe that that's the voice of the heart intelligence coming up to us when we listen. Now back to what I'm saying about this. Third, this type of practice can help take one into the inner silence, which is where the spiritual world exists. Most of us live with a constant stream of inner talk going on whenever we're awake. Using visualization and heart centering can quiet that ongoing monologue. This is in itself one of the main goals of many meditation practices. However, we'll see later that in alchemical meditation, quieting the inner chatter is only the first step that makes us available for relating and even conversing with other beings. Fourth, this simple exercise using breath and imagination can take one to the threshold of profound spiritual experience. Once we've successfully visualized the stone in the heart, we may find that more things happen spontaneously. All sorts of inner events can occur, ranging from the flowing currents of energy to conversational dialogues to inner journeys or even to physical events. Sometimes the heart will temporarily change its rhythm of beating when it feels the presence of a stone being that it really likes. I compare this to a dog wagging his tail. We can see that there's much more to this simple practice than meets the eye. One can, and probably should, perform this practice with every stone in one's collection to begin establishing a relationship with each stone being. I also like to spend a few moments repeating this ritual of invitation and greeting whenever I sit down with a stone, even one that I know well. This is why we call these exercises practices. If we want them to work well, we have to practice. On the subject of practice, ritual, and repetition, I want to mention that these elements not only familiarize one with certain inner experiences, they also help to build the reality within which these things occur. Think about that. The biologist Rupert Sheldrake calls this establishing a morphogenic field, a pattern that the world remembers and which tends to repeat and amplify. We'll go into this more in the chapter on transformation through feedback. Whatever you choose to do in regard to performing this exercise with some or all of your stones, I strongly urge you to keep a journal with notes of your experiences. Many of them may require only a few words, or you might want to draw a sketch of something you saw. Just remember that you're entering into another world, a world that overlaps with the everyday world we all know, but one that is subtle, deep, loving, and powerful. If you keep records and make maps of where you've been, that world will become more and more vivid and alive for you. Having gone through the above practice, most readers will have experienced some sense of contact with the stone being. Many will have felt the stone's energies in their bodies. Some will have an experience of an inner journey or a dialogue with the stone being. In my view, all of these phenomena are evidence that validate the concept of panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental quality of the universe and that there is soul everywhere. So I'll just stop reading to you for a moment and say, taking this idea into yourself and feeling it in its reality is a life-changing thing that we can do. Without even thinking about it, we treat most of the world around us as a bunch of things. If it's shifted to where we experience everything around us as a multiplicity of beings that we share the world with, that's a big shift from the everyday way of looking at everything. And it's an important one. It's fundamental to spiritual alchemy of all kinds, including the alchemy of stones. So it's important to contemplate the implications, as I just said, of these experiences. Merely having them, putting them on a mental shelf, and going on with life as usual wastes their potential. Instead, begin to experiment with acting and thinking as if everything you see, touch, hear, taste, and smell has consciousness and life. Try to feel the presence of soul in everything, from your crystals to your car to the food on your plate. Cultivate your feeling sense, this capacity to discern how everything and every event feels, as you did during the meditation with the stone. Engage with everything in your life as if you are meeting a beloved friend. And yes, it is okay to eat your food, but thank it for nourishing you and offer it your love. I do that. I do it every day. And it makes me feel good on top of whatever else it's doing. So if you give some time and attention to going through your day in this way, you're likely to notice an interesting phenomenon. In treating everything in the world as if it has soul, you'll become much closer to your own soul. You'll begin to feel its presence, and you will find a natural gentleness becoming your new way of being. This is the way of compassion, which is the way of the heart and the soul. Now, some people may argue that events such as our meditative encounters with stones or our experiences of feeling stone energies are not evidence of panpsychism because they are not, quote, objective. Even a part of your own mind may make this objection. After all, we go into the meditation with the intention of encountering the stone being, and we use our imaginations to visualize that happening. My answer to such arguments is simply this: it's correct to say that such experiences are not objective, but it is wrong to invalidate them on that account. Every experience of consciousness, our own and our encounters with other conscious beings, from meditation to daily life, is subjective. there is no real way to prove any of them in an objective sense. That is how some objective, materialist philosophers end up absurdly denying that consciousness even exists. But we're not trying to prove anything to the satisfaction of scientific dogmas. We're exploring the alchemical worldview, trying it on for size, and seeing if it's a more satisfactory point of view for living life and experiencing the world. Remember, the spiritual alchemist does not pretend to sit outside the world or outside of events and observe them objectively. The alchemists plunged in and invested themselves in trying to act creatively in the world. They accepted intuitively and enthusiastically the principle now espoused by quantum physics, that the observer is a part of the event and influences what is observed. My favorite example of this fact is that an observer viewing a rainbow is absolutely essential to the rainbow's manifestation. That is why the rainbow seems to move when you move. It takes three things to make a rainbow: moisture in the air, light, and an observer in a location that is at the proper angle between the moisture and the light. Remove any one of these three, and the rainbow can't be seen. And that includes cameras, because a camera is a mechanical observer. Okay? So panpsychism means, quote, soul everywhere, unquote. To fully take that on means to invest oneself in one's own soul viewpoint. Another name for our soul viewpoint is our interiority. That's the only place where we can genuinely conceive the soul in everything around us, including our friends, the stones. This brings to mind an important quote from one of my heroes, the 18th century visionary Novalis. He was a German romantic poet and philosopher, and he wrote this famous line: "The seat of the soul is where the inner world and the outer world meet, and where they overlap, it is in every point of the overlap." I've also come across another vivid translation of what Novalis wrote, and it says this: "The seat of the soul is where the inner world and the outer world touch. Where they permeate each other, the seat is in every point of the permeation." Now, I've given you both of these translations because the point Novalis makes is one of the keys to understanding alchemy and to receiving the medicine of this book. It is the notion that there is a constant living correspondence between one's own interiority and the world interiority. Our souls and the soul of the world meet within that correspondence. I repeat, this is the medicine of this book. If you take it daily, you will become human in 7 weeks. Guaranteed. So I'm kind of having fun, but I also mean it. If we want to actually become spiritual alchemists and discover the secrets that are at the core of their wisdom, we must be willing to give up the fantasy of objectivity and intentionally locate ourselves in the seat of the soul. In the practice of inviting the stone beings into our hearts, we were purposely working from the seat of the soul. We were choosing to experience the stone in the overlap, the permeation of its inner and outer manifestation. We were reaching out to its interiority from our own interiority. In life, when we choose to guide our perceptions by envisioning that everything has soul and by acting accordingly, we are locating ourselves in the seat of the soul. Again, we might hear the voice of the inner judge, "But you're just imagining all this. You're romanticizing things." I reply with more words from Novalis. To romanticize the world is to make us aware of the magic, mystery, and wonder of the world. It is to educate the senses to see the ordinary as extraordinary, the familiar as strange, the mundane as sacred, the finite as infinite. Now, which world would we rather inhabit? The one that is merely ordinary, familiar, and mundane? Or the world that is extraordinary, strange, and infinite? When we simply spend a moment deeply considering the universe or any part of it, even something as small and humble as a stone, we quickly realize that the real world is the strange, extraordinary, infinite one, and the idea that there is such a thing as an ordinary world is the fantasy. When I offer workshops, people often come up to me at the end of the weekend and they say regretfully, "I wish I could always feel like this, but now I have to go back to the real world." That usually makes my head want to explode, because we've just spent several days working with stones and exploring extraordinary perceptions that are completely real. They really happened. But I do understand. The mass hypnosis that we commonly call the real world surrounds us on all sides, and almost everyone has been thoroughly indoctrinated in it from childhood. There's so much unconscious brainwashing going on in every direction that often when we go even briefly beyond the everyday mundane worldview, we tend to doubt our own experience, even when it is something of immense value to us, or maybe especially then. And at the same time, we long deeply in our hearts to live in that magical infinite world. The reason is, that world is our true home. We ourselves are extraordinary, strange, and infinite. That's why there's a feeling of regret when we believe we have to leave the wonder we've experienced within and go back to, quote, reality. But the reality of the materialist dogma is inadequate and toxic to the soul. I believe it is time to rescue the world and ourselves. It is time to open and commit ourselves to the world our hearts can feel and long to dwell in. To enter that world and live there, we need to learn to perceive it all the time, just as we learned as children at the behest of our elders to perceive the world as mundane. As Novalis said, to do so we must educate our senses. Once again, this is where the stones come in. Just the experience of sensing stone energies, which have no place in the world of materialism, breaks the spell. Feeling the vibrational presence of stones and their songs, in a very literal sense, is an awakening. We need such awakenings in order to feel whole again. As Novalis said of poetry, which can also awaken us, quote, "Poetry heals the wounds inflicted by reason." Poetry heals the wounds inflicted by reason. I'm pretty sure most of us didn't go to school and find that we were told by our teachers that reason was going to be inflicting wounds on us. But let me tell you, it has. And there's a good case to be made that the insane behavior we see in the world around us is rooted in the insane idea of rational, mechanistic reason. That's a little editorial comment from me. So, once we're awake to our sense of wonder and delight and the presence of soul in everything, how do we stay awake? How do we educate the senses? The alchemists did so through the through the conscious, purposeful use of imagination, inviting the stone beings to meet us in the realm of the permeation of inner and outer. The seat of the soul begins with imagination. From there, things move with their own momentum. When we invite them, the stone beings are ready to help us rediscover the magic, mystery, and wonder of our world. I have another practice for you. This is very easy to do. It doesn't even require stones. This practice is called taking a walk. And it builds on the earlier practice of meeting a stone being in the heart. It's a simple way to enact Novalis' advice that it is essential to romanticize the world. Step 1. Go out for a walk in as natural a setting as possible, although you can do this anywhere. As you stroll along, pay attention to whatever you notice: trees, bushes, birds, rocks, water, sidewalks, buildings, people. as well as sounds, smells, and so on. With each thing you notice, imagine drawing your perception of it into your heart as you inwardly say, I invite you into my heart. Next, imagine sending your heart outward to whatever you have just perceived and inwardly say to it, I offer my heart to you. Keep doing this, using silently spoken words for a while, and then try to do the same thing, but as a wordless inner gesture. Feel the invitation to enter your heart being extended to whatever you've perceived. Then feel your heart going outward in the gesture of offering. Notice that each object of your perception has become a thou, another being, with whom you are offering to relate in a loving way. Take this seriously. Pay attention to how it feels to do this, and imagine that you're doing it for real. You're really meeting everything you perceive as another being, and you're inviting it into your heart as well as extending your heart in offer to it. You can easily imagine doing that with a person you see. You can imagine inviting that person into your heart and offering your heart to them. So this next step is to take things that are not people, and even inanimate objects, or sounds or smells, as I said, and do the same thing. And you'll find that the space of your heart expands greatly. And ultimately, when you take your walk in this way, you'll be walking inside the atmosphere of the heart. Not only your own heart, but of the heart of the world interiority. So, when you do this, you'll feel the soul reality of what you've entered into, of what you've entered through imagining, through acting as if it's true. Some people say fake it till you make it. That idea, although I don't think it's faking it, this is understandable that way. Even if you're not convinced, just do it and see how you feel. Now reflect on this and go deeper into feeling it. When you feel everything in the world as another self, someone with whom you're sharing the world, a lovely atmosphere of intimacy replaces the common human sense of isolation. As Novalis said, by romanticizing the world through imagination, you're able to restore, quote, the magic, mystery, and wonder of the world. Contemplate the fact that this simple shift of viewpoint can make such an amazing difference in your own experience of the world. And although you may not know it, it also makes a huge difference in the way the world experiences you. The world is conscious. If another person meets you by extending their heart and inviting you into theirs, that's quite an experience of generosity that we happen to receive from that person. If consciousness is everywhere, as I've been saying, then the world experiences the person who extends their heart to it in this way very differently than the normal, so-called normal person who walks around or wanders around through the world unconscious of the world interiority, or of the interiority of all the things around them. So it may require a few tries to get to this perceptual shift. After all, old habits have a way of persisting, and the one you're trying to shift is a deep-seated one. Our surface self can resist entering the depths and may attack one's efforts to tinker with one's worldview. Just keep practicing. Do it gently from a calm place. If you imagine clearly that you're centering yourself in your heart just for a little while as you take your walk, you'll sooner or later know from the inside what I'm talking about here. Now go back and try the stone practice again. Meet the stone from your heart. Invite the being of the stone to come into your heart, and offer your heart to the stone being. Let yourself imagine that there really is another being there with you. Recently I tried this when I woke up during the night. I sleep with a big chunk of the stone called Rosofia because I find its presence very soothing. I held the stone to my chest and made the invitation. I instantly felt a huge surge of love flow into my heart, and I had the clear sense that the stone being had been waiting for my invitation. In the next moment, when I offered my heart to Rosafia, I felt another surge coming from within me. My deep self had also been waiting. So now we'll have a little discussion about it. The taking a walk practice is an experiment with trying on the worldview of panpsychism. We purposely imagine as we walk along that everything we perceive has consciousness or is an expression of consciousness. We address each object of our perception as if this is true, and we make the offer of loving relationship to all of those imagined beings. When the practice goes as I've described it, we are met sooner or later with the unmistakable felt sense that, oh my goodness, everything actually is conscious, and that the world in all its parts returns our love. That's huge. When that happens and you feel that, that's huge. I have one last thought to offer about this, something I received as a strong intuition when I was doing the taking a walk practice one morning. There's a strange fuzzy line in the border between imagination and perception. You can see where it is as you look at the practice we've been discussing. We begin by following a path we've already planned. Quote, I will do thus and so as I go on my walk, and I will imagine such and such. Then there comes a moment when doing that, what we've planned, gives way to something more happening, something we hadn't planned, as in, I could suddenly feel all those beings in the world, and I felt them loving me back. When you cross that line, you understand what Novalis was talking about. Something magical has happened. That day, my intuition told me this. It's not only that a perceptual shift allowed me to realize that the world is indeed conscious in all its parts. It is also true that my shift in perception helped to actualize the manifestation of the life and consciousness of all the things I was perceiving, because I was perceiving them that way. This is something I've referred to before. It is the co-creative activity of spiritual alchemy, in which the alchemist works with the soul of the world to enhance the aliveness of matter. This is not the same thing as fantasy. It is the opposite of fantasy. This is the realization of how much co-creative power imagination can wield. We all have it, and we can all engage the world in this way. So go back to the idea of the rainbow. If no one's looking, it cannot manifest because being seen is essential to a rainbow being truly there. A rainbow is a visual event. The same is true, I suggest, for the latent consciousness within the world to become manifest. Someone has to look, which in this case means imagining or looking for consciousness in each and every thing. And because the consciousness we seek is latently there to be seen, our act of imaginal perception is the crucial step that actualizes its existence. An analogy I'll offer you to this is, if someone's asleep and you call out, they wake up. In a certain way, calling out from our heart to all the things in our world is a way of awakening in them the consciousness that is there in latent form and making it become active. But we do not make that up any more than we make up a rainbow. You still need the moisture in the air and the sunlight, or no amount of looking will put a rainbow in the sky. The same is true of the consciousness of the world and its parts. If there were no consciousness for us to meet, as we do in the taking the walk exercise and in our stone practices, we could never get past the threshold of our original planned intention. This is the difference between co-creation and just plain making things up. So, the stone beings and all the infinite points of consciousness in the world are present in potential, and they come fully to life when our attention meets them. That door just came fully to life when we talked about it. As I mentioned, it's the same in quantum physics. Until we look, there is no particle or wave, only a probability, a potential. This is similar to the Buddhist idea called interdependent co-arising. And while we're at it, it seems just as true that our own existence and the quality of existence we experience is sustained by the relationship between ourselves and all that we perceive. We ourselves are shaped by our perceptions, just as much as we shape them. If we envision our world as lifeless and mundane, so are we. If we imagine our world as full of magic, so are we, truly. And the really amazing thing is that we have a choice, an infinite number of choices about how we can wield our imaginations to help shape the world and ourselves. But we don't do it alone. We don't make it up. We help to shape what comes to us from nature, from the soul of the world, as the alchemists knew and practiced. We can become the world soul's active partners, beginning with something as simple as taking a walk or holding a stone. And there is one other thing to consider here. It is at least as important and as accurate to say that Sophia and the living world are already there and waiting for us to make the gesture toward them. That is what makes us real, rather than the other way around. And it feels amazingly good to become real. I mean that. It makes us real. It makes us spiritually real and alive to make these gestures and engage the world around us in this way. The alchemists intuitively understood this immense potential of co-creation and how profoundly it could affect the world. This was the insight that allowed them to envision the magnum opus, or the great work, which entailed nothing less than the perfection of the self and the redemption of the world. This is not just our imagination. It is our true imagination. So that completes the chapter on panpsychism. And the next chapter that we'll look at is the one called Alchemy and True Imagination, chapter 4 of the Alchemy of Stones. I hope that I've engaged your imagination in the things I brought up here. This is a short time to introduce a worldview that is completely different from the one that's commonly held by people. I trust that most of you in the audience, most of you who are watching this video, are interested in stones and can feel their energies, and it's not a great leap for you to imagine them as beings. Or perhaps it's not even a leap because you already do. And perhaps you even know them as beings, as I do. This is something that we have many layers in our psyches. And although on the layer in which we are awake and conscious in our daily life, we have a belief that this consciousness is everywhere is true, it's still kind of a digging process as you get down further and see that this materialistic view of the world as a bunch of things that we can do with as we wish, that don't have any awareness or any need for us to feel anything toward them, has many layers because we all grew up in it, or virtually all of us grew up in it. So it's all right. This is how we begin the work. This is how we learn to discover what's inside us and what the interiority of the world around us is like, and what it's like to have loving relationship between ourselves and the soul of our world. And this, I can't think of anything that is more urgently needed in the world now than for people to engage the world soul to soul and get our rational, so-called crazy everyday mindset out of the way so that we can actually experience what's there rather than, just taking the default position that I've already described. So I hope I'm preaching to the choir, and I also hope that some of what I've said today has been interesting to you and has opened your minds up to some new ideas and new ways of engaging with the world and with the stones. We didn't talk about the stones as the main point of this, but that's because this is what underlies everything we do with the stones. This is the magic that makes working with crystals into alchemy, into transformational work, into something that transforms us and has the potential to transform the world. That's what the alchemists believed, and I'm with them on that. So if you want to order this book, because I'm not sure I'm going to read it all to you, you can call the 800 number, or I should say the phone number of Heaven and Earth in Vermont. That's 802-476-4775. Heaven and Earth is my stone company, and they have the books available now. Of all the things I've written, I feel like this book is the most significant, and it certainly was the book that caused me to learn the most that I've learned in my whole 35 years involved with stones and crystals and their energies. So I'm very excited to bring it out, and I have great enthusiasm in recommending it to you. So many blessings to everybody. I reach out to you from my heart, and I offer my heart to you. I invite you into mine. Thank you.